How do people listen to music before Spotify? Tell us. It's interesting to listen. Before streaming and playlists, when music lived on cassettes, vinyl, and old car radios. This is not just nostalgia. This is a story my grandparents left behind, hidden in the songs we thought we knew. There's this moment that hits you out of nowhere, the smell, the sound, the feel of it, and suddenly you're transported to a completely different time. For me, it's music, not the endless playlists on Spotify, not the algorithm telling me what I should like, but the crackling, imperfect, beautiful chaos of music before streaming ruled our lives. Imagine this, a summer evening, the sun just starting to dip behind the houses, and the faint smell of freshly cut grass mixing with the hot asphalt. That's the backdrop. And in the car, there's this clunky cassette player, buttons sticking slightly, tape whirring as it spins. Every click, and his feels alive, almost magical. I remember the first time I held a cassette in my hands. The plastic felt cheap, yes, but somehow sacred. The label was always handwritten, maybe a smudge of marker where someone got impatient. You couldn't just skip songs. You were trapped in the flow of whatever the artist had laid out for you. And that forced something magical. Patience. Anticipation. You didn't just hear the music, you felt it. You could feel the tape stretching, the little gears working like tiny musicians themselves, creating a sound that was slightly off from the original, but in a way that made it yours. Before Spotify, before iPods, before even CDs became the mainstream obsession, the radio ruled our lives. And not just any radio, but the kind you had to actually fight for, tuning in the frequency slowly, fingers pressing buttons while the antenna wiggled to catch that perfect signal. Static, fading voices, DJs who sounded like they were in a secret underground world. They all added to the thrill. Waiting for your favorite song to come on wasn't annoying. It was like waiting for a letter from a friend you hadn't seen in years. You'd sit there, ears pressed close, memorizing the DJ's voice, hoping you didn't miss that one moment when the music would hit. And then came vinyl. Oh, vinyl. I swear there's nothing in the digital world that can mimic that first scratch of the needle hitting the record. You'd flip the album cover, admire the art, read the lyrics, and then with a dramatic flourish, drop the needle onto the spinning disc. The sound that came out wasn't just music. It was history, it was craftsmanship, it was emotion distilled into vibrations. You couldn't just listen and move on. You had to experience it. And when it was over, you had to physically flip the record, rewind the tape, or tune in the radio again. There was a rhythm to it, a connection to music that was physical, tactile, real. In the car, music wasn't background noise. It was a companion, a co-pilot. We had those old-school boom boxes, magnetic tape decks that rattled, hummed, and occasionally refused to work unless you slapped them gently just right. Rolling down the windows, letting the summer air rush in, and blasting a song until your chest vibrated with the bass. It wasn't about showing off. It was about feeling alive, feeling something raw and unfiltered. You couldn't share it with friends online. You had to invite them in, press play, and let them experience it with you. And somehow, that made every beat, every lyric, every guitar riff feel heavier, more important. There's a certain intimacy to that old-school music experience, something Spotify can never replicate. You had to pay attention. You had to be present. And maybe that's why when I hear a crackling cassette or the soft hiss of vinyl, I get pulled back to those endless summer nights where music wasn't a commodity. It was life itself. Every song carried a story. Every skip in the tape felt like a heartbeat. And every song that played just as the sun disappeared over the horizon was perfect. So here's my confession. I miss that. I miss the waiting, the imperfections, the sound of music that forced you to lean in, to live in the moment. Before Spotify, before algorithms, before shuffle became a thing, music was a ritual. It was anticipation, excitement, connection. It wasn't just something you listened to. It was something you lived. And if you ever stop to think about it, maybe it still is. There's a special kind of thrill that comes from music when it's in a car. I mean, really in a car, the seats worn just enough to feel lived in, the dashboard dusted with sunlight and fingerprints, the windows slightly open so you can feel the wind push against your face. Back then, Music wasn't just playing, it was part of the ride, part of every twist and turn of the road. And it wasn't digital, it wasn't endless. It was a cassette in the deck, and every song felt like a choice you made together with whoever was in the passenger seat. I remember my first car stereo. It wasn't fancy, just a rectangular box with buttons that clicked, a volume knob that felt like it could break if you turned it too hard, and a little slot that welcomed the cassette like a fragile treasure. You had to insert the tape with care, push it in until it clicked, and then wait for it to start spinning. That moment, that slight whirring hum, was electric. The music didn't just play, it filled the entire car, wrapped around the seats, the steering wheel, the air, until it felt like it was part of you. And then there were mixtapes. Oh, the mixtapes. Making one was an art form, a ritual, a declaration of feelings you couldn't put into words. You'd sit for hours, headphones on, recording songs from the radio or other cassettes, pressing record with precision, hoping the DJ's voice wouldn't interrupt the perfect snippet you wanted. Each pause, each beep, each slightly off-timed start wasn't a mistake. It was character. The mixtape was your soul pressed on a magnetic tape. Fragile, fleeting, unforgettable. You'd give it to a friend or someone you liked, and the act of handing it over was almost sacred. You were saying, "This is me. Listen and understand." In the car, playing someone else's mixtape was a journey in itself. You'd pop it in, hit play, and suddenly the world outside the window didn't matter. Every song, every pause, every little hiss between tracks was a story. You could feel the excitement of someone else's choices, the moments they laughed, the songs that mattered to them, the emotions they wanted you to feel. And because you couldn't skip easily, you had to sit through it all. The good, the bad, the cheesy, the heartbreakingly perfect. There was patience, there was discovery, there was intimacy. I remember driving with friends late at night, the city lights painting streaks across our faces. We'd take turns playing our favorite tapes, arguing about the best songs, laughing when someone included a ridiculous track, groaning when a song repeated too many times. But that was the point. Music wasn't just sound. It was a conversation, a memory, a shared pulse. You didn't just listen, you connected. And somehow, that made every word, every lyric, every beat feel heavier, more alive. Magnetic tape had a personality. It could jam, it could stretch, it could even eat a song entirely if you weren't careful. And yet, that imperfection made it human. You couldn't just replay a song instantly. You had to wait, rewind, and play again. You had to be present. And in those moments, surrounded by friends, wind in your hair, laughter echoing, music became almost a living thing. Messy, unpredictable, beautiful. Sometimes I think about those nights and wonder if anyone who grows up with Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube will ever understand it. The excitement of discovering a song by accident, of passing a mixtape around like a secret, of waiting for that perfect moment when a song hits just right, it was a kind of magic. You couldn't buy it, you couldn't stream it, you couldn't download it. You could only live it fully in the moment. And it wasn't just about the music itself. It was about the experience, the hum of the engine, the smell of the upholstery, the camaraderie of friends crammed into a small space, the feeling that you were making a memory that could never be duplicated. Every scratch on a tape, every click of the stereo, every song that played, just as you turned the corner became part of the story, part of your life, part of the soundtrack that didn't exist anywhere else. I missed that more than I realized. Not the convenience, not the algorithms, not the endless options, but the intimacy, the patience, the joy of sharing something fragile and real. There's a kind of love in the act of making a mixtape, in pressing play for a friend, in driving through a quiet street with the music filling every corner. It's the kind of love that doesn't exist in a digital playlist, no matter how many songs you can scroll through. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear a cassette hiss, or the faint whir of an old car stereo, I can almost feel it again. The laughter, the voices, the stories we shared, the songs that defined us. Not just as a generation, but as individuals searching for something real. And I realize that's what music was before Spotify. Not just sound, not just a playlist, but life itself. Messy, imperfect, unforgettable. If mixtapes were the heartbeat of the car, vinyl records were the soul of the home. I still remember walking into my grandparents' living room as a child and seeing the tall wooden cabinet that held their collection. The records were lined up like soldiers, spines facing outward, each title whispering promises of evenings filled with music and stories. The very air seemed different there, warmer somehow, heavier with nostalgia, as if every note that ever played in that room had left a residue, a memory, a heartbeat that lingered in the corners. The ritual of playing vinyl was a ceremony. First, you had to select the record, the decision already charged with anticipation. Every choice carried weight. Do we want jazz tonight or something classical? Maybe a little rock and roll from the 60s? The selection was an unspoken conversation, a reflection of moods and memories. You'd lift the record from its sleeve, careful to touch only the edges, as if even a fingerprint could disturb its magic. Then, the turntable, majestic, almost alive, waited for its cue. The needle would descend, a gentle kiss, and suddenly the room was filled with sound unlike anything else. The hiss, the crackle, the warmth of the analog tones. Music became tangible, almost breathing. I remember my grandmother sitting in her favorite chair, knitting quietly, glancing over the top of her glasses at the record spinning. My grandfather would lean back, a glass of something strong in hand, listening as if he were revisiting a memory he never wanted to forget. And I would sit cross-legged on the carpet, mesmerized. Each song was a story, a history lesson, a time machine. Vinyl didn't just play music, it played emotion, layered in static and groove and soul. It wasn't just about listening, it was about presence. You couldn't shuffle vinyl. You couldn't skip easily. You had to sit, you had to wait, you had to be there for the rise and fall of each record. And because of that, there was a rhythm to life at home, a slow, deliberate pace that made every note more meaningful. The songs became part of conversations, part of jokes, part of the way we learned to laugh together, argue gently, and then forgive. Family traditions built themselves around these moments. Saturday mornings meant breakfast accompanied by the soft crackle of classical records. Lazy Sunday afternoons often found us sprawled across the living room, debating over the merits of this band versus that one, the needle tracking across the grooves as our voices blended with the music. Holidays were even more magical. Carols on vinyl, played over and over, each rotation embedding the melodies into the walls, the furniture, the very essence of home. There was a certain intimacy to sharing music like this. My parents would occasionally hand me a record they loved in their youth, their eyes glinting with a secret. This is something you need to know about us, about where we came from. And as the first notes played, I felt connected, not just to them, but to something larger, to a generation, to a world before instant gratification, to a time when patience and presence were a kind of love. The physicality of vinyl made every interaction tactile. Flipping a record over, placing it back in its sleeve, rearranging the collection. These were acts of care. And in doing them, I learned to respect music not as background noise, not as something disposable, but as something sacred, something that demanded attention, demanded reflection, demanded feeling. I also remember the sense of discovery that vinyl created. Unlike the endless scrolling we do today, each record had limits. You couldn't just skip to your favorite song instantly. You had to sit through the album, experience the intended journey, feel the emotions intended by the artist. And sometimes, in that enforced patience, you stumbled upon magic, songs you never expected to love, melodies that would linger for years, lyrics that would resonate long after the needle lifted. But perhaps the most unforgettable part was the shared silence between songs. The pauses, the crackles, the soft sighs of a family content in the presence of music. It was more than sound, it was communion. Everyone in that room, young and old, participating in a single experience, a single memory. That's something Spotify can't replicate. There's no buffer, no algorithm, no shuffle that can create that same sense of belonging, that same intimacy. Vinyl demanded attention, and in return, it gave you a kind of love that was impossible to ignore. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I close my eyes and can almost feel the texture of those evenings. The warmth of the living room, the soft golden light spilling across the floor, the needles sliding across the groove, the laughter and quiet conversations overlapping with music. And in those moments, I understand something crucial. Music in its oldest, most analog forms wasn't just entertainment. It was connection. It was memory. It was home. And as much as I love technology, as much as I can navigate Spotify, YouTube, and endless digital libraries, there's a longing in me, a yearning for the rituals, the imperfections, the physicality, and the intimacy of the music we listened to before streaming ever existed. Because that music wasn't just heard. It was felt, deeply, intimately, permanently. And that's when it hits me. Every time I hear a vinyl hiss, a cassette whir, or the faint static of an old radio, I'm not just hearing music. I'm hearing generations, experiences, moments frozen in time, speaking to me across decades. And I realize this is why music mattered before Spotify. Not the songs themselves, but the life we built around them. The connection, the care, the magic of shared experience. Little did I know the next time I stumbled across an old tape or record, I would uncover a secret buried in our family's history. Something that would make me see all those songs, all those moments, in an entirely new, almost shocking light. Something that would change the way I thought about music and about my family. I never expected that a lazy Sunday afternoon, the kind where sunlight spills across the living room and everything feels timeless, would become a day I stumbled upon a secret buried deep in our family's past. It began innocently enough. I was helping my grandfather clean the attic, a dusty, shadow-filled space that smelled of old wood and memories. Boxes of forgotten photographs, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and crates of vinyl records leaned against the walls. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Among the clutter, one small, unassuming box caught my eye. It was labeled in faded ink, "Do not touch, private." My curiosity, of course, overpowered my sense of caution. Inside were several old cassette tapes, some handwritten, some typed with neat, careful lettering. Titles like Summer '76, Conversations, and The Truth About Us jumped out. My heart skipped. I'd grown up hearing stories about my family, stories carefully edited for my innocence. But something about these tapes whispered that there were chapters one had never been allowed to read or hear. I took one tape out and slid it into the old cassette player my grandfather had kept in pristine condition. The first click of the machine was almost ceremonial, a sound I associated with anticipation, not fear. Then the tape whirred to life. At first, it was faint, the muffled voices of my parents when they were young, laughter, arguments, casual chatter. But as I listened closer, I realized these recordings weren't just family moments. They were confessions, fragments of lives carefully hidden from me. One tape contained a conversation between my grandmother and someone whose voice I didn't recognize. They spoke in hushed tones about events I'd only heard distorted versions of. Secrets about business dealings, whispered mistakes, regrets, and decisions that had shaped our family in ways I could never have imagined. There were moments where the speaker paused, almost afraid the walls might be listening, almost as if the tape itself was a silent witness to truths too dangerous to say aloud. Another tape revealed music my grandparents had recorded themselves, songs they had written not for public release, but as personal messages to each other. Lyrics that hinted at hidden love, unspoken betrayals, even choices that changed the course of their lives. The music was raw, imperfect, hauntingly human, and unlike anything I had heard on Spotify or vinyl. It wasn't polished for consumption. It was personal, intimate, almost sacred. As I sat there, tape after tape revealing layers of my family's past, I felt an unsettling mix of awe and fear. These recordings were more than just memories. They were confessions, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. I realized that every record my grandparents had played, every cassette we had listened to, every song that filled the living room, had been a backdrop to a life filled with secrets, some whispered, some buried deep. And then I found it. The last tape in the box, tucked into a corner as if deliberately hidden. Its label read simply, "For you." My hands shook as I inserted it into the player. The first sounds were not music, not laughter, not arguments. They were voices I recognized, my parents this time, but speaking in a language that was coded, familiar only to our family. They were speaking of events, people, and decisions that had shaped not just our household, but the lives of people I had never met. As I listened, the story unfolded in real time. A scandal involving relatives no one ever mentioned, debts and favors exchanged in secrecy, mistakes that had haunted my grandparents for decades. I could hear the fear, the shame, and also the love in their voices, the complex emotions that no photograph or casual anecdote could ever convey. It was like listening to a novel written in code, a narrative hidden in plain sight for generations. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed, and somehow connected. The music we had treasured, the albums we had argued over, the records and tapes we had played and replayed. They were all part of a carefully curated soundtrack to a life I had never fully known. Every song had been chosen not just for enjoyment, but for context, for memory, for guidance. My family had embedded their history in melodies and rhythms, hoping perhaps that one day I would listen closely enough to understand. And just as I thought I had uncovered everything, the tape ended with a message that made my heart stop. My grandfather's voice, older now, trembled slightly as he said, "If you're hearing this, it means you've found the truth. But be careful. Not all stories are meant to be told. Some truths can change everything." I sat in stunned silence. The attic seemed darker, heavier, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath. For a long moment, I wondered if I should stop, if I should return the tapes and pretend I had never found them. But curiosity and something deeper, a need to understand my family, my roots, and myself, pushed me forward. It became clear to me, then, that music had always been more than entertainment for my family. It had been a vessel for secrecy, for love, for guilt, for redemption. And if I was brave enough to follow its trail, I would uncover not just the songs and melodies, but the very heart of my family, its mistakes, its triumphs, its hidden sorrows, and its unspoken joys. By the time I left the attic that day, I knew life would never feel the same again. Every record I played, every song I heard, carried a new weight, a new meaning. I had begun a journey into the past, guided by the voices and music of those who came before me. But I also understood one terrifying truth: some secrets, once uncovered, cannot be contained. And what I had discovered hinted at even deeper revelations, truths that could change everything I thought I knew about my family, my history, and even myself. Little did I know, the final revelation was waiting for me, one that would turn everything upside down, a truth hidden not just in tapes or records, but in a memory so long buried that it almost seemed fictional. I could feel my heartbeat echoing against the attic walls as I stared at the final tape, the one my grandfather had labeled simply, "For you." Every fiber of my being knew that this was more than a message. It was a key. My hands trembled as I inserted it into the old cassette player, the click of the mechanism sounding louder than anything in the quiet house. The tape hissed for a moment, like it was waking from a long slumber, and then a familiar yet distant voice filled the room. It was my grandmother. Her voice, tender and deliberate, spoke words I had never heard before, recounting a chapter of our family's past that had been hidden from me for years. She spoke of choices made in fear, of secrets kept for protection, of sacrifices that had shaped the generations that followed. Each sentence was weighted with emotion, a mixture of sorrow, hope, and an almost haunting sense of inevitability. As she continued, the words became entwined with music, soft piano chords barely audible, weaving in and out of her speech. Then came another layer, a melody she and my grandfather had recorded themselves decades ago, a song of love, loss, and quiet rebellion against circumstances they could not control. The combination of voice and music created a strange, almost hypnotic effect, pulling me deeper into a world I had never fully known. It was in that moment that I understood this music was a map. Every song, every recording my family had cherished, every cassette and vinyl record in our collection was a breadcrumb trail, leading me through the labyrinth of our history. The hidden tapes, once an enigma, now felt like a conversation across time. My grandparents had left a message for me, embedded in the melodies, waiting for me to listen closely enough to hear it. The revelations came like a torrent. I learned of a betrayal that had divided our family silently, a misunderstanding that had festered for decades, creating rifts nobody ever dared to address. I learned of a love story that had been concealed out of fear and societal expectation, a story that had shaped marriages, decisions, and even the music we played on repeat in our living room. Each revelation was more shocking than the last, but together they painted a portrait of a family far more human, flawed, and resilient than I had ever imagined. At one point, the tape shifted. My grandmother's voice became urgent, almost pleading. If you are listening, it means you are ready. What I tell you now is the most important. There is a song, our song, you must hear to understand everything. It is hidden, but it is here, within the music you have always loved. I froze. My mind raced. Our song? Hidden? My entire childhood, the music that had filled our home, suddenly took on a new meaning. I remembered an old vinyl record tucked away in the far corner of the attic, one I had overlooked countless times because it seemed ordinary. Heart-pounding, I pulled it from its sleeve. The label was almost illegible, worn from age, but etched faintly with a single title, The Story We Could Not Say. I placed the record on the turntable, careful not to breathe too loudly. The needle touched down, and immediately the music began. The first notes were familiar, yet entirely new. They carried the voices of my grandparents, singing, speaking, laughing, and crying all at once. Each lyric was a confession, a revelation, a memory encoded in melody. It told of love lost and regained, of mistakes corrected and uncorrected, of hope hidden in despair. Every note resonated with the truth my family had carried silently for decades. As I listened, tears streamed down my face. This was not just a song. It was the essence of our family, the culmination of years of experience, joy, sorrow, and secrecy. The music revealed truths no photograph could capture, no conversation could fully convey. I understood, finally, why certain albums have been played over and over, why some songs have been insisted upon, why some records were forbidden. Each was a chapter, a message, a legacy left for me to uncover. And then, the song shifted unexpectedly. Beneath the music, faint at first but growing louder, was another voice. My grandfather's, older now, almost a whisper. Remember, music carries what words cannot. Protect it, understand it, and you will understand us. In that instant, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The family secrets, the hidden tapes, the forbidden songs, they were never meant to harm or shame. They were a testament, a record of survival, love, and resilience. And through the music, I could connect to my grandparents, to the lives they had led, to the struggles they had faced, and to the sacrifices they had made for the generations that came after them. The song ended, but its echoes lingered in the attic, in my heart, in the air around me. I realized that music had been more than a soundtrack for our lives. It had been a guide, a keeper of memories, a messenger from the past. And I, finally, had become its listener, its interpreter, its inheritor. As I turned off the player, the attic seemed lighter, somehow less oppressive, filled with the hum of a legacy I was only beginning to understand. I knew that these revelations, hidden in melody and voice, would stay with me forever. And I also knew that the act of listening, truly listening, had changed me. In the end, it was not just the music that mattered. It was the truth it carried, the stories it told, and the connection it created across generations. And for the first time, I felt the weight and the gift of being part of family whose history, like its music was rich, complex, and unforgettable. I left the attic that day with more than old tapes and records. I left with understanding. I left with a story that no one could take away. And above all, I left with a song that, when played, would forever remind me that the past is never truly gone. It only waits for someone willing to listen.